2022 has been a challenging year for journalists across the world. A record 363 journalists are behind bars, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. The figures which have been revealed represent a 20% increase from that in 2021. In Africa, 56 journalists are in jail for their works, according to the watchdog, with Egypt, Eritrea, Cameroon, and Morocco topping the charts. The recent sentencing of Ahmadou Vamoulke, the former Director General of the Cameroon Radio Television in Cameroon, has once more brought to light Cameroon's press freedom report. In today's edition, we are digging deep into press freedom in Africa as we explore the Vamoulke affair, as well as the 2022 annual Prison Census of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Stay with us. My guest has worked for more than 2 decades as a journalist in South Africa. She has been editor of the tabloid Mail and Guardian, former Secretary General of the South African National Editors Forum. She also worked for the Witness and Mercury newspapers as editor and was presidential correspondent during Nelson Mandela's term as South African president. After almost 25 years in journalism, she moved to New York in the year 2016 to take up her role with the Committee to Protect Journalists. With a strong background in human rights and advocacy, she has been able to break boldly about injustices meted to journalists and defend their rights with utmost strength. Join me to welcome Angela Quintal, the African Programs Coordinator of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Angela, welcome and thanks for talking to Dash News. You're welcome to the program In Depth.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the recent imprisonment of Ahmadou Vamoulke, a verdict, of course, which came last month. You described the sentence of Ahmadou Vamoulke, the former general manager of the CRTV, as a monumental travesty of justice. Why do you think so?
I think we have to put this in context. For example, in Cameroon, after Eritrea, journalists like Ahmadou Vamoulke and C. Conrad and the others have served the longest in prison. You know, Vamoulke has spent more than 6 years in prison, effectively in preventative detention. And we saw his trial being postponed more than 140 times. You know, there were all these adjournments. And so what you've seen are fair trial standards and due process standards that have been consistently violated. Add to that the fact that he's 72 years old, that he is in poor health. You know, as far as the Committee to Protect Journalists is concerned, he should never have spent 1 day in jail, let alone having already spent 6 years in what has really been a flagrant abuse of the standards of fair trial and due process. And I must say, it's not only the Committee to Protect Journalists that is saying that. All you have to do is look at the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. When it issued its report, it called for his immediate release and noted that the way that he had been treated had actually violated the very fair trial procedures and standards, international standards that I have outlined.
Vamoulke, according to Cameroonian authorities, was convicted for tampering with funds of the Cameroon Radio Television Corporation, the CRTV, which in no way, has a link with his role as a media professional. Does the Committee to Protect Journalists agree with this? And if no, why?
So let me say that the world over, and I think Vamoulke, again, is an example of what we see around the globe when governments, resort to what we call retaliatory charges, and they do that to abuse the legal structures, to punish the press, right? Either, and also to create a climate of self-censorship. So when I say that what we've seen here in his case, we see the world over, it really is where governments think that they are able to use retaliatory charges to effectively con the world or to try and tell the world that it's not a case of press freedom. Oh, this person is facing economic charges, they're facing embezzlement, or it's, you know, sex crimes, or, you know, even anti-state charges. It's never about journalism, but that really is a cover. And so in our CPJ and other organizations believe that Ahmadou Vamoulke was targeted and has been targeted because of what was seen as him not towing the line, that he was far too independent for the minions and the mandarins who are in government in Cameroon, and who were not happy with his performance at the state broadcaster.
What does the Committee to Protect Journalists know about Ahmadou Vamoulke?
So for me, the bottom line is this. This is a 72-year-old journalist, right? And he is one of the journalists that has been the longest in jail in Africa, okay? As I mentioned to you, we've had journalists in Eritrea who've been detained the longest. But he is 72, his health is very poor, his detention has been found to be arbitrary by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. There is absolutely no reason why he should be in jail. And that, for me, is sufficient for us to ensure that we would be trying to get his release, as we are trying to do with all the other jail journalists in Cameroon. And of course, we're also aware of his health, right? Peter, we know that he is in very poor health. The conditions that he's been held under in Condé, as most other prisoners are, given the terrible conditions in Condé, the overcrowded conditions. I mean, this really is an accident waiting to happen. And I think I've said this before. I'm saying, has the Cameroonian government not learnt from its past errors, from the fact that other journalists have died in detention? You know, do we want a third journalist to die in detention? That's how basic this is. Ahmadou Vamoulke is very ill, and it is time that he is released and that he's able to receive the treatment that he needs, which he cannot get in Cameroon, and that he is allowed to spend time with his family, having experienced 6 years of an unjust detention.
Following the sentence, has the Committee to Protect Journalists spoken to Ahmadou Vamoulke? If yes, what exactly has transpired?
Look, we are not, obviously, because he is detained in Condé, we do not have direct contact with him, but we do have contact with his lawyers, and we have been in constant contact with his lawyer throughout. You know, I mean, right now, what we need to do is ensure that somehow the authorities understand that his release is imperative given the poor state of his health. And certainly, if the government of Cameroon does grant CPJ a visa, because as you well know, in the past, CPJ has wanted to visit, but that was stalled and we never did receive the visa. But if this year we can get a visa to visit CPJ, believe me, I will be the first one at Condé prison, if allowed, to see Ahmadou and all the other jail journalists that are being currently held there.
Media watchdogs and some human rights organizations say that Ahmadou Vamoulke's imprisonment was done with a violation of justice, but the Cameroon government, however, believes that all legal provisions were respected. Has a Committee to Protect Journalists contacted Cameroonian authorities on the Vamoulke case, and what has been the feedback?
So, Peter, one of the things that the Committee to Protect Journalists believes in is having open dialogue with governments. We are not in a combative relationship with governments. It is in our interest and in the interest of the journalists whom we try to protect, to have that interaction with the government. So there have been repeated attempts. What we have seen is over the years, there's been a hardening of attitudes from the government of Cameroon. It's no longer willing to engage. And it has in fact rebuffed all our attempts. I mean, repeatedly, we've reached out. This wasn't the case previously. under, for example, the former communications minister. Under the current minister, Rene Sade, we found that it's been very difficult. But it's not only the minister. We've reached out to the cabinet office. We've reached out to various aides, advisors, and so on, in the hope that the government will be prepared to talk to us again, because I think at the end of the day, this is not something that is in the interest of the Cameroonian government. It is not in the interests of CPJ and the journalists it seeks to protect. And so again, I reach out publicly once again to ask the Cameroonian government to, when I phone, when I try to speak to people, that they actually do engage and not hide behind a wall of silence. I think it's not in the interest of the Cameroonian government to be seen as one of the worst jailers of journalists. And there are ways to resolve this issue. And dialogue is key. And that is something that I would like to see, that once again, the government of Cameroon starts engaging with CPJ. In the past, when we've had this engagement, we have seen journalists released. And that is what I'd like to see in 2023, that open dialogue starts up again.
The Vamoulke affair has once more brought to light the press freedom in Cameroon. The recent report by the Committee to Protect Journalists said there are 5 journalists that are imprisoned in Cameroon. Angela, tell us please about the situation of the other 4.
All right, so let me put it as bluntly as this. Cameroon is the 3rd worst jailer of journalists in Africa. I mean, think about it. The 3rd worst jailer of journalists after Egypt and Eritrea. It's also appeared on our annual prison census repeatedly since 2014, right? That, again, is no record to be proud of. Ironically, one of the lawyers who actually is a lawyer for one of the journalists, Kingsley Njoka, who's currently detained, was actually one of the journalists detained in 2014. This is what we're talking about in Cameroon. Now, who are the journalists who are in jail, other than Vamoulke? We've got journalists like C. Conrad, who's also one of the longest-serving journalists in Africa, who's been detained the longest. We have Mancho Babiksi, we have Kingsley Njoka, and we have Thomas Awa. So we have 5 journalists currently, all in Condé, all serving, those who have been prosecuted and convicted, all serving long sentences. Now, let's look at those who have been convicted other than Vamoulke. When you look at Thomas Awa, when you look at Mancho Babiksi, and you look at C. Conrad, these were journalists who were arrested, detained, prosecuted by a military tribunal on anti-state charges. Now, as civilians, the fact that they were charged and prosecuted in a military tribunal is already a violation of international standards. That's the first thing. The second thing relates to the fact that they too have been arbitrarily detained. And this has been found not by CPJ, by none other than the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. So again, everything points to the fact that the way that these journalists have been treated is that their rights have been violated, due process and fair trial processes have not been followed. Now, these journalists have used the system and have tried to appeal. And what has happened with their appeal? The appeal has been hanging for years now because of administrative delays. So that in itself is also another violation. Then let's move to someone like Kingsley Njoka. For over 2 years, he's been held in pre-trial detention. It's only recently that he has appeared in court and the trial is now proceeding. But all of this, all of what you see is lengthy delays and adjournments. Everything that would shout and scream from the rooftops that these are violations of international standards of fair trial processes. And again, we have maintained that no journalist should be detained in jail for their work. And we believe that all of them are detained, not as the government says, because they are terrorists, but because they have, because of their work and because the government doesn't like the sort of journalism that they have done.
Last time when we spoke on this program, you mentioned that the Samuel Wazizi affair has not been forgotten. What has the Committee to Protect Journalists been doing about it?
I think, as I tried to explain earlier, we often see anti-state charges used as retaliatory charges against journalists. So yes, we know that journalism is not terrorism, right? A journalist is not a terrorist. As it seems that what the government has done is it has used a very wide anti-terror law, right? It's the anti-terror law that is on the statute books in Cameroon is so wide that anyone's grandmother who happens to actually say something that upsets some official in government could, under that law, actually be labeled a terrorist, right? That law has been used to crack down on dissent and on views that the government doesn't like. That does not make you a terrorist. And so it is very simple to throw an anti-state charge at a journalist. We see it the world over by repressive and autocratic governments. It does not mean that journalists are actually terrorists or are separatists or whatever. I mean, journalists have a job to do. The government might not like their manner of reporting, but that is no reason to throw a journalist behind bars, try them by a military court, and accuse them of being terrorists. I come from South Africa. I've seen what happened under apartheid South Africa. Many journalists, many people were accused of being terrorists. They're now in government. So we need to get real about what is at stake here. It is the use of anti-state charges in retaliation for journalism that the government doesn't like. And I repeat, journalism is not terrorism.
Cameroonian authorities maintain that these journalists were not arrested for doing their job, but because of their affiliation with separatist groups and secessionist leaders in Cameroon. What is the view of the CPJ concerning this?
So as I said to you last year in our interview, justice for Wazizi remains an important part of our work. And I said then that one of the things that needed to be done was that the domestic recourse had to be looked at, and we had to ensure that all of that is done before one could look at international fora. Now, the lawyers who have acted on behalf of Wazizi from day one, when we still thought that he was being detained and not that he had died in custody, have exhausted those remedies within the domestic sphere. So now we have to look at what we can do elsewhere, and that is where we're looking at the regional court, at the African court, but we'll also look at international at other international fora. We've got to ensure that there is justice for Wazizi, and if it's not going to happen in the domestic courts, then we will be going elsewhere. And because this has been exhausted now, we are in a position to be able to go to the African court. And my understanding is that the lawyers are actually looking at that.
Most times when we talk about the problems which journalists face covering the Anglophone crisis, much attention is being focused on what the government is doing to journalists, which is wrong. But also, journalists also face lots of rights violations from separatist fighters. How is the CPJ handling that?
Yeah, I think that journalists in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon are really between a rock and a hard place. I mean, they're targeted by both sides, both by the government forces and the non-state actors, the separatists. And if you look at CPJ's research, we've actually documented violations not only by the government and by government forces, but by separatists. And we've obviously condemned these. You know, just as we've condemned the wrongs that government has done, we've condemned those by the separatists. And what we have done is, and there have been examples when journalists, for example, have been kidnapped by separatists, and we've seen a lot of that, right? is that we have used our contacts and we have tried to ensure that they have been released unharmed. So for us, at the end of the day, no one, neither the government or a non-state actor or the separatists, should be attacking journalists, and we will be the first to issue a condemnation, which we have done.
Back to the Vamoulke affair. Vamoulke's lawyers say that they are going to appeal the verdict that was given to him. What is your view about it, and what is the committee to protect journalists expecting from judges that will receive the appeal file?
Well, ideally, we would want the prosecution not to contest the appeal. And of course, we would want the appeal judges to do the right thing and to finally acquit him and allow him to return home. I mean, he needs to be a free man. He's wasted 6 years of his life in jail for something that he should never have been detained for in the first place.
Let's now talk about the global prison census. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that the imprisonment of journalists has reached a record high within 30 years. What explains this disturbing trend?
The bottom line, democracy is in retreat worldwide. It's not only on our continent, it is worldwide. You've seen that that democracy is in retreat. And so what you've seen when you have these record figures is, there is a steep decline in the rule of law and the erosion of democratic norms globally. That's the bottom line. And I think the other thing is that it actually brings into sharp relief, what governments are prepared to do, the lengths that they will go to silence reporting that they believe is critical of them or seeks to hold power to account.
In Africa, Eritrea remains the worst jailer of journalists. How disturbing is the situation over there, and how is the CPJ trying to help victims that have been put in jail?
Well, I mean, it's of huge concern. We're talking about journalists in Eritrea who have been jailed without trial, and no one knows where they are since 2001, right? That's when we saw the crackdown on the independent press in Eritrea. And as you know, Eritrea remains one of the most censored nations in the world. And so trying to even get information about their well-being, trying to get, people to visit them to see how they are, there's absolutely nothing. It is so egregious that this has been able to continue, and that journalists and others have been held without trial for as long as they have. I mean, think about it. Since 2001, and no one knows where they are being held. They've not had any trial. It is absolutely shocking. Yeah, look, I think what CPJ and other partner organizations are working together. One of the things that we have done is we have begun looking at international, what one will be able to do in terms of targeted sanctions against individuals under the Magnitsky Act. This is a process that we have started. The Canadians are looking at that. So ultimately, it's now time to start squeezing the individuals who are involved and that they feel the pain, that they shouldn't be allowed to continue their lives as normal while they continue to deny the fundamental human rights of others, of other citizens. So that has been an important aspect, obviously, in terms of trying to ensure that the UN Special Rapporteur is able to have access, those sort of things. We need to work with bodies that should have the sort of access to try and ensure that we are in a position to put pressure on the government to do the right thing and to release them. It has been, as you can see, a long and lengthy process, but it's not in our interest or the interest of the journalists to throw up our hands and say, oh, we're not getting anywhere, we're just not going to bother. We've got to continue to ensure that we try all avenues in the hope that one day the Eritrean government will see the light, or that there will be a change and that the government will actually do the right thing. Miracles happen. Again, going back to my own situation in South Africa, many people thought that apartheid was never going to end, that we were never going to have a democracy. And in the end, it did happen. So I'm hopeful that change can happen and that those journalists will be released eventually.
Recently, also, Somalia has come under criticisms. The president, Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, has ordered that journalists submit the content of their works to authorities before they are published. What is the reaction of the Committee to Protect Journalists on that particular order?
Look, the Committee to Protect Journalists is opposed to any sort of pre-publication censorship. That's a no-no. It's interference with editorial independence, and that's exactly what is going on. It's censorship, and it is pre-publication censorship, which is totally which obviously we're opposed to. Look, the media freedom environment in Somalia continues to be of huge concern. So the government, for example, has been targeting the Secretary General of the Somali Journalist Syndicate, and he is being dragged through the courts on trumped-up charges. That sends the wrong signal. It is an attempt also then to ensure that other journalists become fearful and are silenced. But over and above that, we also have a situation where in Somalia, unfortunately, when it comes to impunity in crimes against journalists and the murder of journalists, it is the worst in terms of our impunity index. And so it is really important to ensure that there is, in fact, accountability when it comes to crimes against journalists. What CPJ wants to see is not journalists being jailed, but it's the government ensuring that those who kill journalists, who are guilty of crimes against journalists, that they are the ones that are held to account. They are the ones that belong in jail, not the journalists.
Now, every time we talk about press freedom, the press must be free. Angela, can you please tell us what are the ingredients of press freedom? What are the variables which, if a country has, could determine that this country is a good advocate and disciple of press freedom?
I think it's pretty simple. It's really, the ability of journalists, right, to report on matters freely and on matters that are obviously of interest, so that they can, of public interest, so that they can inform citizens, and that they can provide a platform for the sharing of information and ideas by all citizens, so that there is an open exchange of information and ideas. That's really the bottom line. When you start restricting that, right? When you start restricting what is really a vital function of democracy, then I think that it harms everyone. It harms both governments and citizens alike.
Zambian president has come under lots of appreciation for triggering a major reform in press freedom in the country. Recently, he abolished criminalizing insults on the president. How much is that good for press freedom? And what is the role that the Zambian press must do? Does that mean that they will just have to insult the president, knowing fully well that they can't be held responsible for it?
Right. So it was fantastic when we heard the news that the insulting the president's law had been repealed. That was great. So criminal defamation of a president and insults laws is not only in Zambia, it's around the world. So the fact that they've gone one step to actually stop the insulting of a president and to say that it's no longer a crime is fantastic. Obviously, CPJ would like to see all insult laws and criminal defamation abolished. Now, our leaders are not gods, and they should be held to a higher standard. And what one person sees as an insult may not be an insult. So at the end of the day, what journalists want to say about a president, they need to say it, but then at least ensure that it is backed up by facts. I mean, gratuitous insults is not what journalism is about. But what we have seen the world over is that when leaders are in power and don't like being criticized, that they are thin-skinned and will take offense when in fact courts around the world have said that the standards should be higher because they are public servants, they are holding public office, and therefore should have thicker skins than ordinary citizens.
Let's now talk about impunity for crimes against journalists. This particular trend has been growing on a disturbing proportion. Why does it continue? Why is it that we do have impunity for crimes against journalists, where journalists are killed and nothing is being done to bring justice to them?
I think it continues because there is absolutely no accountability. No one is held to account for these crimes. So when there is no punishment, when there is no deterrent, it is no surprise that impunity will continue. Let me just use an example, because on Monday, that's the 16th, right? It's going to be 4 years since a journalist in Ghana was assassinated, an investigative journalist called Ahmadou Vamoulke. He was killed in the streets of Accra. He was murdered, right? There has been absolutely no attempt to ensure that his killers are found and prosecuted. Now, what signal does that send? It shows that, in fact, literally, you can get away with murdering a journalist in Ghana. And we've seen when it comes to members of the security forces, in fact, we're about to come out with a report that when it comes to that sort of impunity, that members of the security forces who have assaulted, who have tortured, who have committed crimes against journalists are getting away with it, all right? That they are not being hauled before the courts and they're not being held to account. So there's absolutely no deterrent factor. And that, I think, contributes to why you actually see an increase in impunity, because people know that they will get away with it.
Let's look at the case of female journalists in the profession. Female journalists also face a lot of harassment and challenges in their work. What are some of these obstacles, and how does the CPJ help in ensuring that they stay safe in the practice of journalism?
Yeah, look, and it's, again, you know, it's on our continent, it is of particular concern. So let's just take the basics. The sexism that you see, the chauvinism, the fact that there is not equal pay, the fact that women journalists are not necessarily getting the opportunities to advance, you know, when you have the so-called glass ceiling there. The sexual harassment that one finds, both within newsrooms and when journalists are out in the field, all of that remains a problem for journalists. And now, in this day and age, we also have what we've seen in terms of the digital sphere, where you have got women journalists in particular who are the subject to online abuse, violence, and harassment. So much so, and it is so bad that you actually have women journalists who are leaving the profession because of that. So all of this has an effect not only on journalists, women journalists' morale, their safety. It, at the end of the day, has actually led to them leaving a profession and not being able to earn a living. Now, what is CPJ doing? We're very concerned, particularly about the online violence and harassment that women journalists are finding. And so with its partners, what we're doing is trying to ensure that we're able to empower journalists, give them the advice on how to try and at least protect themselves online, but also ensure that they get the psychosocial support that is so necessary for them to be able to continue their jobs.
Angela, since 2016, you are now with the Committee to Protect Journalists, where you merge your talent as an advocate as well as a human rights defender. Tell us, what drives you?
What drives me? What drives me is the fact that as a journalist myself, that when I see that journalists are being targeted, that I feel that I need to do what I can to ensure that they're able to do their jobs properly. That has been, I think human rights has been my passion, and the right to media freedom and the public's right to access to information is a fundamental right. And for me, that is key to ensuring that democracy can thrive in this world and that we do not live in a dictatorship or under an autocratic government where we are not able to speak and to report freely.
Angela, you became a journalist in South Africa's transition to democracy 2 years after the unbanning of liberation movements on the eve of the first democratic elections. How challenging was it being a journalist at that time?
So yes, as you rightly say, South Africa transition to democracy started in 1990 with the unbanning of the liberation movements. I became a journalist in 1992 as we saw the negotiations between the apartheid government and the liberation movements as South Africa moved towards a democracy, the democratic elections that we held in 1994. And because it was 1992, I was already seeing the fruits of liberation in the sense that it was a lot easier for journalists to operate. We were able to contact people who would have been regarded as terrorists, phoning them in Lusaka, talking to them, quoting them. We were no longer seeing a state of emergency that was banning journalists from writing about people who were supposedly viewed as terrorists by the apartheid government. There was certainly an openness, and unlike the height of apartheid, where journalists were being jailed, where you had state of emergency regulations that would stop you from being able to quote a particular individual in the newspaper, or where you had the censors coming in and ensuring that you could open a newspaper and you would see that certain things had been removed by, ensuring, you would read a report and you would see this black type that you couldn't read what was actually being, what had actually been written, because someone had gone and censored it in terms of the law because they believed it wasn't something that could be said. So by that time that I had started my journalism, I wasn't party to that. I didn't run the risk of being arrested under the terrorism law or anything like that, that many of my colleagues who had been journalists before that had actually had to suffer. And I certainly didn't find the censorship that they had endured under apartheid. So I was very lucky in that respect. And then the best thing was to have been a journalist in our democracy, those first 5 years of democratic rule, where we saw law after law being repealed, racist laws being repealed, when there was still a sense of hope that something was going to be different, and where our liberators became the government of the day, and that democracy finally came to South Africa, a dream that many people had actually thought was not going to happen in their lifetime.
Now, the African continent is facing many socio-economic and political challenges. Angela, do you think that these challenges faced across the continent could have an impact on journalism practice in the year 2023?
Well, I think it is important for the media to be embedded in communities. You know, you can't have a media that is a media of elites and only speaks to elites. If you want to ensure that you have the trust of the community, you have to be operating within the community. You can't possibly be sitting on a telephone on the other side of a phone and think that you can do justice to issues that are happening on the ground. So I think that you need to see the sort of journalism where journalists are in the community reporting on what actually is of interest to communities and what is happening to communities, as opposed to thinking that this is what people want to read or want to hear or see on their television screens. But I think ultimately you also need to ensure that journalists do act ethically, that journalists are above reproach, you know, and I think that that is important, that when journalists are there and are seen not to be doing things for themselves, but are actually ensuring that they are holding power to account, that's where the trust will develop, as opposed to being seen as propagandists, for example.
Now, the African continent is going through socio-economic and political challenges. How will this affect press freedom this 2023?
Yeah, you know, people always look for scapegoats, don't they? Governments will always look for scapegoats when things go wrong, and when things aren't going well. And who better to blame than the messenger, right? You see it the world over, not only on our continent. We saw it with the pandemic, how governments used the pandemic then to ensure, to the COVID pandemic, to try and tighten the screws on the press, on trying to ensure that they were in a position to control the narrative, okay? So when you see what is happening on the continent and elsewhere, particularly when it comes to when there are protests, when there is civil unrest, I mean, let's just look at the fact that there are going to be major elections coming up this year in countries that with large populations and are also, you know, let's look at Nigeria, which is an important country in Africa, right? You have, as soon as you see that and you see elections, you see a clampdown on the press, and you see an uptick actually on attacks on the press, and that for CPJ is of great concern. And so you will invariably see a correlation between when things are going bad economically or socially, or when there's an election, you will see an increase on threats against journalists, because at the end of the day, it's a case of governments wanting to ensure that they are able to control the information that is getting out there, and anyone who steps out of line or isn't towing the official line is then seen as a threat, and then that's when you see more violations against the press.
And perhaps before we go, I would like to ask you, the year is just starting and the CPJ continues its defense and advocacy work to protect journalists across the world. Are there some major events which the CPJ will organize or is looking up to? What should we, media professionals, be expecting from the Committee to Protect Journalists?
So as in any other year, this is what the Committee to Protect Journalists protects journalists. So what are our major plans? We look at areas that we believe are going to need attention. And so I mentioned how in some countries, including Nigeria, the DRC, for example, Zimbabwe, there are going to be elections there, and we know that with that, we are going to see an increase in violations, and we have already seen that. So it is important that in terms of the safety of journalists, that they get the support that they need, and two, that we document the violations, because ultimately we are an organization, a research organization that bases our advocacy on our research. One of the things that CPJ wants to do, and I personally want to do, is to ensure that Cameroon and what is happening to the journalists in Cameroon gets an extra boost, that we are able to ensure that we get the journalists out. Ideally, I would like to get a visa. This time, it has been in the past, I have not been able to visit because the process has been stalled. I would like the government to give me a visa that I can come and visit Cameroon, and that one can have the sort of dialogue that I think is necessary to try and ensure that the 5 journalists who currently are in jail are released. I think that's very important, and that is certainly a personal priority of mine, and will be for CPJ. But I think ultimately it's just trying to ensure that journalists, ordinary journalists who are not, celebrity journalists, who are not known to the world, that those journalists know that there is an organization who will be in a position to try and assist them and will not ensure that they are forgotten in their time of need. And that is something that is routine, that we do day in and day out, and we will continue to do that in 2023.
All right. Thank you very much, Angela Quintal, the African Programs Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, for talking to us. It was a pleasure having you in this edition of the program, In Depth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, to you too, and to your viewers.
And that does it for this edition of the program. Until next time, bye-bye. Stay tuned to Dash News.